A key narrative for a long war in Ukraine is that we are there to support the sovereignty, freedom, and democracy of Ukraine. These are sacred values, key to our own identity and key to peace. So, this is why we have to continue fighting. However, the counter-argument is that Ukraine has simply been hijacked to be used as a proxy in a war against Russia. Now, which is it? Is it a fight for sovereignty, freedom, and democracy, or a proxy war? This question can be settled by looking at how NATO has acted towards Ukraine throughout this war. Has it supported or robbed Ukraine of its sovereignty, of its freedom and democracy? First, it's worth noting that this war began in 2014 after Yanukovych was removed from power by force. Now, this was a coup which removed the democratically elected president of Ukraine, which should be the first hint. The coup also violated the Ukrainian constitution. The coup was not supported by the majority of the population, and not even the riots at the Maidan had majority support from the Ukrainians. The new government was then found out to be handpicked by the Americans before the coup. That is, they decided who should be in the government, who should stay out, and how this could all be glued together.
So I don't think Cleach should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you think what in terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political homework and stuff. I'm just thinking in terms of sort of the process moving ahead, we want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be Tony Book and his guys. And, you know, I'm sure that's part of what Yanukovych is calculating on all of this.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, you know, what he needs is Cleach and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week, you know. I just think Cleach going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Okay. Good. Well, do you want us to try to set up a call with him as the next step?
He's now gotten both Seri and Ban Ki-moon to agree that Seri could come in Monday or Tuesday.
Okay.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, you know, fuck the EU.
No, exactly.
The key objective for the Western-sponsored coup was to pull Ukraine into the NATO orbit. However, this also did not reflect the will of the Ukrainians. Indeed, as every polling showed between 1991 and 2014, approximately only 20% of Ukrainians wanted NATO membership. And furthermore, NATO countries also knew that this would invite war, because attempting to pull Ukraine into NATO would likely trigger a civil war, as it was unpopular. This would especially occur or be the case for the East, as many people cautioned, including the former CIA director William Burns when he was the ambassador to Russia. So this was a war that would be launched against Ukrainians in the East, as we saw in 2014. In the East, they did not recognize the legitimacy of this government, so a war was supported against them.
Petro Poroshenko will have a hard time winning back hearts and minds in this city. As the people of Donetsk sweep up the debris of their homes and livelihoods, they are hardened against a president they say is killing his own people. We are Ukrainian, but they kill us, this man says. So we probably need our own country, because these people in Kiev, they are not brothers for us.
Now, after the coup, we saw that the intelligence agencies of Ukraine were hijacked. Immediately after the coup, we saw that Ukrainian intelligence agencies were effectively transformed into mercenaries on behalf of the US and the UK. The New York Times reported in 2024 that immediately after the coup, the new spy chief of Ukraine, which, by the way, was part of the new government that the United States had installed, he walked into the office, and the first thing he did was to go into an office and pick up the phone and call the CIA and MI6 for a three-way partnership that would entail recreating Ukraine's intelligence agencies as instruments to be used in a covert war against Russia. Keep in mind that only the week before, the Ukrainian population and the intelligence agencies have been friendly to Russia, been cooperative. Now, the CIA's partnership with Ukrainian intelligence agencies after the coup entailed, as the New York Times also tells us, to build secret bases in Ukraine at 12 locations along the Russian borders, where the CIA could also train Ukrainian commando groups to go into Russia, to spy on Russia, steal Russian military equipment, such as drones. And not just New York Times, the Washington Post also writes that since 2015, although this turned out to be since 2014, the CIA has transformed Ukraine's security services into potent allies against Moscow. A US intelligence official explained that the military intelligence services of Ukraine had to be rebuilt from scratch. So again, this was reinventing the entire intelligence services. Indeed, it had to be built from scratch because the former had a good relationship with Russia, something that reflected the interest of Ukrainians. Now, a senior European official also noted that towards the end of 2021, Putin began to consider, or was considering, to invade Ukraine, simply because, well, one of the key reasons was he was informed that the CIA and MI6 now controlled Ukraine's intelligence services and would use Ukraine as a beachhead for operations against Russia. So again, not in the interest of Ukrainians and not supported by Ukrainians. Now, we also saw that other branches of the Ukrainian government also fell under US control. Energy companies and Ukrainian industries were to be linked towards the West and away from Russia. Indeed, we saw only 3 months after the coup in 2014 that Hunter Biden, the son of Joe Biden, and that he was placed into Burisma. Both Hunter Biden and a close family friend of the US Secretary of State at the time, John Kerry, they both became members of Burisma. However, Hunter Biden had no experience or competencies in either gas or in Ukraine. So, but again, this was not a skill-based employment. Now, government appointments also had to be approved by the United States. As anyone entering the new government first had to get the green light from Washington. This was also confirmed by Ukraine's general prosecutor, Viktor Shokin. Now, in a statement, Mr. Shokin said that the most shocking thing that all the government appointees were made in agreement with the United States. He further went on to argue that Washington's behavior indicated that, quote, they believed that Ukraine was their fiefdom.
Вы понимаете, мне вообще кажется многое странное в отношениях того периода времени президентства Обамы по отношению к Украине. На мой взгляд, они расценивали Украину как свою вотчину. Господин Байден унизил президента, унизил Украину, показал всему миру, насколько он хозяин в Украине. И это было ярко проявлялось во всех сферах деятельности. Все назначения согласовывались с американской стороной, с Байденом в частности, все назначения, начиная даже от заместителя генерального прокурора.
When the general prosecutor Viktor Shokin began to investigate Burisma, where Joe Biden had placed his son, Joe Biden had the general prosecutor of Ukraine removed from his position, despite the US having until then praised him for a good job. Now, having a foreign power fire your general prosecutor is usually not a good indicator of being a proper sovereign state.
I had gotten a commitment from Poroshenko and from Yatsenyuk that they would take action against the state prosecutor, and they didn't. So they said they were walking out to the press conference. I said, no, I said, we're not going to give you the $1 billion. They said, you have no authority. You're not the president. The president said. I said, call him. I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting $1 billion. I said, you're not getting $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here. And I think it was, 6 hours? I looked, I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Oh, son of a bitch. Got fired.
So, besides the decision which Ukrainians should be allowed to be in government, the US also put its own people inside the Ukrainian government to ensure compliance. The most important example would be the role of the finance minister. That is, in 2014, Natalie Jaresko took the position of finance minister of Ukraine. And she even received a Ukrainian passport on the very same day. Now, Jaresko was a former US State Department official. She was also the former economic section chief of the US Embassy in Ukraine. So she could go from a position where she represented American interests in Ukraine to then taking the position of the actual finance minister of Ukraine. Now, other foreign nationals also took high-level positions in Ukraine to make sure that that the coup would be permanent. Now, what about the Ukrainians, you may ask? How would the political opposition react to this hijacking of its government and its intelligence services? Well, the main political oppositions from the East were purged. And when the leading opposition politician, Viktor Medvedchuk, rose high in the polls as a result of the political oppression, he was arrested. And eventually he was even stripped of his Ukrainian citizenship. So the Western media, instead of standing up for the rights of Ukrainians, they instead provided a cover, ensuring the public that he was pro-Russian and therefore he's illegitimate, irrespective of any support he may have had among the Ukrainians. Now, the basic rights of Ukrainians were also stripped from them, and we saw this cultural purge. Now, the first act of the post-coup Ukrainian parliament in 2014 was to vote in favor of abolishing language rights of minorities. This is quite dramatic in a country like Ukraine, given that about 20% spoke Russian as a first language, and the majority of Ukrainians speak Russian, if not as first, as a second language. Yet, the decision was made that Russian should be removed as a second language, which obviously had a huge impact in the south and the east of Ukraine, where most people speak Russian as a first language. Now, we further saw that the new government, backed by the US, would ban Russian language books, movies, and other works, not just coming from Russia, but in Russian. We saw the Orthodox Church was also deemed to be an unacceptable cultural link between the Ukrainians and the Russians. And this also resulted in suspending religious freedoms by suppressing the church, and we've also seen several attacks on churches. But again, this is what freedom looks like when freedom is interpreted as freedom from anything that's Russian, even its own population, to the extent they have a similar culture. Now, what about the media? How would the Ukrainians react using the media as an instrument? Well, this was also dismantled. The opposition media was shut down, some were nationalized, much of the media was placed under the control of the president, and of course a lot of this censorship was celebrated by the United States. Indeed, in 2021, we saw that the former US ambassador to Moscow, Michael McFaul, he celebrated this crackdown on opposition politicians as well as the media. In Michael McFaul's words, quote, his decision to ban pro-Russia television networks and to charge their owner and Putin ally Viktor Medvedchuk with treason was a daring act that needs US support. So keep in mind, this is not media channels owned by Russians, these are Ukrainians. But again, they're deemed to be too friendly towards Russia. So again, they're banned as well. We also saw that the Foreign Policy Journal also celebrated censorship. It posted headlines such as Ukraine's president finally flexes his muscles. Volodymyr Zelensky is taking on his country's pro-Russian media machine. Yet again, anything that's deemed friendly to Russia and seeking to restore relations is defined as illegitimate. After all, Ukraine was being developed as a proxy. Now, we also learned, looking at the media, that by 2025, when Trump shut down the funding to USAID, we learned that between 85% and 90% of all Ukrainian media had received finance by USAID. This is a US government agency financing the vast majority of Ukrainian media. And we can then ask, to what extent would USAID accept any dissent from the US position on Ukraine? And furthermore, USAID was also involved in the coup in 2014 and remains deeply involved in manipulating Ukrainian civil society. And indeed, this is another aspect. Civil society could also not be left to the Ukrainians, as the US run and finance the NGOs that claim to represent civil society. This is yet again considered another normal thing, that the US government will finance US so-called non-governmental organizations, which then should have the right to represent and mobilize the Ukrainian public. And how is this power used? Is it to elevate the role of democracy? No, on the contrary, it's used to shut down democracy, not just by toppling the government, but we saw back in 2019 that when the Ukrainians were finally allowed to vote, 73% of Ukrainians voted for the peace platform of Zelensky.
На Востоке и в Крыму люди хотят говорить по-русски. Отцепитесь, отстаньте от них. На законном основании дайте им возможность говорить по-русски. Язык никогда не будет делить нашу родную страну. У меня еврейская кровь, я говорю по-русски, но я гражданин Украины. Я люблю эту страну и не хочу быть частью другой страны. Россия и Украина, мы действительно братские народы. Я знаю миллионы, я знаю тысячи людей, которые живут в России, замечательные люди. Мы одного цвета, у нас одинаковая кровь. Мы все друг друга понимаем, независимо от языка.
Again, it's hard to remember now, but Zelensky actually ran on a peace platform. He was going to make peace with Donbass, with Russia, and he was going to implement the Minsk peace agreement, which the West was seeking to sabotage. Now, we saw that NGOs, they backed rallies against this peace mandate, which was denounced as capitulation. When Zelensky went to Zolote to push for pulling back heavy weapons from the front line, he was met by threats from neo-fascist militias, which had been armed and trained by the United States. So again, Zelensky had to plea that, in his words, I'm the president of this country. I'm 41 years old. I'm not a loser. I came to you and told you remove weapons. However, he was met again with threats that they would march on Kiev. And we saw members of parliament, you saw various leaders of fascist groups, all coming out, giving death threats against Zelensky. And so eventually, it was nothing he could do. Indeed, he had to accept them into his government, which gave the US a powerful veto over any future efforts to make peace. But it wasn't just the right-wing extremists that the US could use as instruments to put a check on any democracy in Ukraine. We also saw that Western-financed NGOs were also used to end the very popular and democratic peace mandate. NGOs such as Ukraine Crisis Media Center even published red lines of what should not be crossed. Now, these red lines, again, for NGO financed by Western countries, included, the red lines were as civil society activists, we present a list of red lines not to be crossed. The NGO further goes on, should the president cross these red lines, such actions will inevitably lead to political instability in our country and the deterioration of international relations. This is hardly a very well covered threat. And the red lines, which they warned Zelensky not to cross, included holding a referendum on the negotiation format to be used with the Russian Federation and on the principle of a peaceful settlement. It included conducting negotiations without the Western states, making concessions to the detriment of national interest, failing to implement security and defense policy of the former government, which had been replaced, It also entailed, quote, delaying, sabotaging, or rejecting the strategic course for EU and NATO membership, and also attempting to review language laws, or even supporting the Russian Orthodox Church, and of course, ignoring dialogue with civil society, which meant the NGOs, which meant the Western governments. Now, these red lines and the pressure from the right-wing extremists was nothing less than a demand to abandon the entire peace mandate. And it worked. Democracy was overcome. Zelensky had to reverse his position and abandon his peace mandate. So the election results were effectively meaningless. So, against their will, we saw the Ukrainians had their government toppled, their intelligence agencies hijacked, political opposition purged, free media eliminated, cultural, language, and religious rights suspended, and the vote for peace, the one say they did have, was abandoned. And when Russia eventually invaded to impose neutrality on Ukraine in 2022, we saw that the Ukrainians also had to become cannon fodder. That is, not only did the US and UK sabotage the Istanbul peace agreement in early 2022, which, by the way, also Zelensky warned would lead to the destruction of Ukraine, something that the Americans would do nonetheless, or he said some Western states would favor a long war, even though it led to the destruction of Ukraine, because it would enable the West to use Ukrainians to bleed Russia. Also not something that would be done in Ukraine's interests.
Я думаю, що у всіх різні інтереси. Причому у всіх у Заходу є ті, хто хоче, щоб ця війна йшла довго. Тому що це буде виснаження Росії, але ціною України, ціною життя людей. Це точно вигідно деяким країнам.
Now, after sabotaging the Istanbul agreement, we saw that NATO boycotted diplomacy and negotiations over the next 3 years with Russia. When they saw the people, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians being killed on the battlefield, the main thought was we should not sit down with the Russians because this could give them legitimacy. So again, a long war was sustained and pushed. And indeed, in this war, it's hardly seen to be in the favor of Ukrainians. Indeed, Ukrainian men are not allowed to leave the country. And videos emerge every day of Ukrainian men who are snatched from the streets, they're thrown into vans and sent to the front lines. And while in Ukraine, Ukrainian mothers and wives protest the abduction of their sons and husbands, Western media do not want to show these videos because it's feared that it will reduce the support for the proxy war among their own public. So they ignore the plight of Ukrainians and their suffering because it could undermine the war effort. So this is not the actual standing with Ukraine and support for Ukraine which is being sold. This is supporting the war, irrespective of what the Ukrainians want. Now, it's worth taking a look back, remembering back in 1993, before a decision had been made to expand NATO, George Soros, he made his case for why we should pursue a world order where NATO would be the dominant institution. But also Soros argued that Western societies would find it difficult to accept large casualties among their own soldiers, which is why Eastern Europeans could be used as meat. In his words, quote, the combination of manpower from Eastern Europe with the technical capabilities of NATO would greatly enhance the military potential of the partnership because it would reduce the risk of body bags for NATO countries, which is the main constraint on their willingness to act. On the other hand, the body bags for Ukrainian soldiers has been proven not to be such a great concern. So, we have nonetheless now reached the end of the line. The war has been lost, NATO has run out of weapons, and NATO has also run out of Ukrainian men to fight and die. And the NATO allies are now divided. How should they react as the proxy war comes to an end? The Europeans insist that they will stand with Ukraine, yet the majority of Ukrainians want negotiations. They're even willing to accept territorial concessions to get peace. So standing with Ukraine has become a euphemism now for keeping the war going and rejecting peace. Now, the Americans are worried that the war has been lost, of course, and the only thing that can be done now is either look at Ukraine collapsing or NATO must escalate to the extent it can spark a third world war. And even if this doesn't happen, continuing the war would push Russia towards China. So the Americans have now deviated from the Europeans. President Trump and the majority of Americans want to end the war. So Trump is pushing Zelensky to come to the negotiation table, and the message is somewhat clear. This war cannot continue without us, and we are pulling the plug. So both sides, both the Europeans and the Americans, are making the decisions for the Ukrainians. The Europeans demand that they continue to fight against the will of the Ukrainian people, and from the United States, the language is often even more blunt, that in a proxy war, it's not for the proxy to decide when the war ends. It's for whoever controls them.
We run the world. This is America's world. He's our proxy. This ends when we say it ends. It doesn't end when Zelensky, if he wants to go it alone, go it alone. I'm glad we helped him. Russia invaded. We got his back. At first, it was the right thing to do. But now it's not. Now the war's over, and he doesn't recognize it's over. And reality is going to eat this guy alive if he doesn't recognize this.
Now, we keep referring to this as the Ukraine war, but Ukraine has surprisingly little to do with this war. It's a proxy war between NATO and Russia to shape what should be the European order. Should be a hegemonic system where the largest country in Europe, that is Russia, has no say. Russia should be pushed out of the Black Sea. Or is it Europe where Russia asserts itself and have a greater role? Either way, this is what Ukraine has become. It's become a proxy war for two different visions of Europe. And like any other proxy, it's not intended to decide for itself. There is no sovereignty, there's no democracy, and there's no freedom. Referring to sovereignty, democracy, and freedom, these are merely battle cries now to sell war as peace and to sell the narrative that we have not destroyed Ukraine over the past decade. No, we have been helping it. Now, Ukraine was systematically stripped of its sovereignty, its democracy, and freedom since 2014, and it can only be restored by accepting that Ukraine should not be a battlefield between the great powers, that it should not be a proxy. And to do this, a wider negotiation is required, not just one of a ceasefire between the Russians and the Ukrainians, but one that seeks to find an agreement between NATO and Russia to prevent countries like Ukraine from being used in this way, or even in the future, that other countries on the front lines or the dividing lines of Europe, be it Moldova, Georgia, or others, would similarly be used as a proxy.